Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome back to our second night in the basement. And in some ways, it's very appropriate that we're meeting in a basement because metaphorically, that's often the place where the breakthroughs happen. God often comes to us while we're metaphorically in the basement, and we're talking about issues tonight and over the next couple of weeks that often we don't air in a nice, light, breezy space where life is going well. We're talking about things like fear and anxiety tonight, and guilt and shame, the things that perhaps we tend to shy away from in ourselves, the conversations that perhaps make us feel a little bit awkward, particularly if we feel that we should be doing better when in fact we're struggling to cope. But one of the common features of all of those emotions that we've mentioned, fear, anxiety, guilt and shame, is that they thrive on silence, and they thrive on secrecy, and even more on judgment. So that if you are frightened to admit that you're struggling in one of these areas, then that very thing is the thing that's going to make any progress much more difficult. It's very important that we actually talk about these things as a community here in the basement. And for those who are watching or listening in from outside, this is a conversation. It's not an internal meditation just on your own situation. Last week we started talking about fear, and we talked last week about the fact that the most foundational fear of all fears is the fear of death. And that does mean physical death, but it doesn't just mean that. We fear the death of relationships, we fear the death of our reputation, we fear the death of our status, we fear the death of the things that we've invested a lot of mental, emotional energy into, particularly if we have come from a world which sees itself as a sort of self-defining world, you know, where it's up to us to make our identity and define our image and so forth, and we've invested a lot in that, and the fear of death around that is very great. So fear of death permeates all of our fears. After last week, there was a question which came in, and the questioner was basically saying, is it not also that we fear death because we weren't created for it? We weren't made to die. We are, in the end, creatures destined for eternity. And I would say, yes, that's true. We are creatures made for eternity. But in that space, I would probably put grief more than fear directly, in the sense that you know in a relationship, as you grow together, that relationship shouldn't just end. It just seems wrong that it's taken away. And something in you, subconsciously perhaps, says, no, this is something that is supposed to last, and now it's gone. So that, I think, is part of the evidence that all of us as a humanity have this sense that we're built for something beyond just this life. And yes, that may attach some sense of fear to it, but it also, I think, more deeply attaches this sense of grief and this sense of loss, that we're made for something far greater than this, and that to find ourselves, so to speak, coming to the end and flopping into the grave out of exhaustion, as most good Christians do, flopping into the grave out of exhaustion, that's not what life is all about. So that's why we're here. We touched briefly on what we did last week. Remember last week we spoke about some of the social psychology research under the heading of terror management theory, and how all cultures build up these anxiety buffers to keep the fear of death at bay. Fear and anxiety are almost inseparable, so we're going to talk about anxiety tonight, but we're also going to come back to this question of fear repeatedly, and that will come up again in other evenings, I'm sure. Well, let's come back one step. Who has not worried in the last 7 days? Who has not worried about anything? Who's a liar? Oh, it's okay, so we're all in the space where we can talk about worry and anxiety and fear, okay? So there's no counsel of perfection in this room. To the degree that you feel comfortable, list the things around your table that you worry about, either general or specific. And then ask yourself this: are there any common threads? What sort of things do people worry about?
Staying on top.
Sorry?
Staying on top.
Staying on top.
House, or your work, or your kids, or whatever. I'm staying on top.
Okay. Getting ahead, staying on top.
Yeah.
Okay. Other things?
Health issues.
Yeah. Health would be a big one, wouldn't it? Yeah. Other things?
Is it good enough? Am I doing my job well enough?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. That's a performance anxiety type thing, isn't it? And yeah. Other things?
Life balance.
Yeah. Who finds that getting a bit harder nowadays? Life balance. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Don't you worry about your kids too?
Children.
Yeah. Whether they're grown up or not, whether they're little or grown up, you still worry about them.
You never stop being a mum, do you, or a dad? It just goes on. Someone was saying just before the session started tonight that their eldest is getting married, and so grandparenting is next, and suddenly old age and back.
It's a one-way ticket, right?
Wish, what was that? That was your life, mate. Go on. Any common themes? Common things.
Was freedom of speech, like in the kitchen,
Yep.
like your freedom of speech of what you're allowed to say and what you're not allowed to say.
Ah, that's a new one, isn't it? Freedom of speech, political correctness, yeah. Some of our politicians are trying to explore that space, and some of them not doing very well at the moment. There's this drumbeat, isn't there, of terrorism, financial instability, ecological chaos, political uncertainty and instability, the rise of violence as a means of prosecuting your political case, no matter which side you're on. All of those things is coming through the media all the time. There is, of course, in all of that, a circle of very wide concern over which we have no control at all, and that tends to dominate perhaps a lot of our worry. When you bring it down to the circle over which we have some influence, even if we don't have control, it tends to be a very small circle in the end. Let's ask Kirsten, where does worry end and anxiety begin? But every one of us here has admitted that we worry, but there comes a point where that worry turns into something debilitating. So, how does that happen? What's the end of worry and anxiety in a medical stroke psychological point of view that's problematic?
So I think there are probably two questions there to tease out, and one is the difference perhaps between worry and anxiety. They both really come from the similar parts of the brain. Worry is thought to be more of a thought-based cognitive process. So you may not be speaking out loud, but you might be thinking through particular concerns that you have. Whereas anxiety also includes physical symptoms. So you may experience anxiety without being aware of the thought-based component. So most of us would be familiar with the feeling of what you call butterflies in your stomach, heart racing, mouth going dry. So perhaps if you weren't expecting it and somebody asks you at work to make a presentation in front of a big group of people that you're not familiar with on a topic that you're not familiar with, you might have that sudden rush of nerves and anxiety. So that's the difference between worry and anxiety. And then the question was about when does that become problematic? Yeah. So look, medically we would think that any of the psychological conditions are a problem when they go on for more than just a week or 2 weeks. In the case of some of the anxiety disorders, we think actually they're a problem that happen on most days of the week, if not all, for sometimes 6 months or so or more. And they don't just affect you, they're not something that's only contained within yourself, but they affect perhaps your family functioning and your relationships at home. They affect your work functioning, or perhaps if you're a child, your ability to go to school. So they start to really push out and impact on your social relationships, your work functioning, as well as what's going on within you. So that becomes potentially quite severe. In terms of symptoms of generalised anxiety disorder, we start to see not just a few neck aches and pains that suggest that you might have been a bit tense at work, but people come in with persistent muscle aches and pains, back aches, tummy aches, headaches, other things that perhaps there's no other medical explanation for. So it's quite a common condition, quite a serious condition. In fact, I looked up just to see in the Bible if there's an example I could find, and it's a little difficult to try and take a term that we use today and fit it into something that was written about so long ago. But in Deuteronomy 28, where God's talking about the exile, it actually says that it's the Lord that is bringing about an anxious mind. So it says, "There the Lord will give you an anxious mind. Among the nations you'll find no repose, no resting place for the sole of your foot. Your eyes will be weary with longing. He'll give you a despairing heart. You'll live in constant suspense, filled with dread, both day and night, and never sure of your life." So I thought that was really a pretty good description of a generalised anxiety disorder.
We'll come back to that later, because that impacts on what Jesus says later when he says, "Do not be worried, do not be anxious." We'll come back to that a little bit later. But last week, following on from this, you just mentioned that phrase that we were writing in the joint paper together. If I can read it out: physical illness is not just a bodily thing, and mental illness does not just reside in the mind or the emotions. Does anxiety or generalised anxiety disorder, does that illustrate the point? How do those two things go together?
Well, we mentioned some of the aspects of an anxiety disorder, including the neck pain, vague stomach complaints, back pain, headaches, which is so common. There are probably other things which also could be associated with a higher level of anxiety, including nausea and vomiting out of the blue. Some people have something called a cyclical vomiting syndrome, where just out of the blue they can vomit, and that can be at work or it can be at home, and it's pretty disabling. There are other anxiety disorders, including panic disorder, which I think we mentioned a little last week, but that certainly brings people to the emergency department where they feel that they're having a heart attack, because it's not something that's just contained with thoughts going a bit wild, but actually your chest constricts. People also feel that perhaps they're developing an asthma attack, so they're using a lot of their asthma medications. Sometimes pain in the jaw and the left arm, feeling of impending doom. So it's a terrible state to be in. It does come to an end, but certainly our bodies really respond to what's going through our brains. And in fact, one of the psychology lecturers I had many years ago said, sometimes when there's a person who's had some physical symptoms for so long, they've had every investigation under the sun. For example, they just can't use their hands, sore hands and wrists, and saying to that person, what is it in your life that you can't handle? Or saying to even a person with an eating disorder, what is it actually that's making you want to vomit? What is it that is...
what is it that you're sick of?
That's right, what are you sick of? So that just illustrates some of the little connections between the mind, body and spirit.
A little bit later we'll come to talk about some of the mechanism. There's a lot of research about some of the deep brain structures that impact on our physiological responses. We'll come back to that a little bit later. But just at your table group now, before we go to a break, the first question was about what you worry about, okay? The second question is, how do you worry? What does it do to you? I mean, for you, is it a sleeplessness thing when you're worried? Or for you, is it how is it that worry, anxiety affects you, your experience of it? Not just what you worry about, but how do you worry? Do you know what I mean? So let's have a bit of time talking about that around your groups or at home, and we'll come back and then have a break in a minute. Okay, who'd like to make a comment about what's been happening?
I think for me, sleeplessness is the issue for me. Getting to sleep, staying asleep, and you think you've got over it over the night, you stop worrying, but then you still wake up worrying about the same thing, and it might be minuscule. And that could last for an hour or two, or maybe all day, depending on what the actual worry is.
That sleeplessness response, how common is that, and what's going on medically, biologically with us?
Look, there's probably a few parts to that answer, but in terms of sleeplessness, there's certainly a lot of hormones that are released when we're anxious. So we think about, and now it's neuroscience has filtered down to all of us, so we hear about cortisol, we hear about adrenaline and noradrenaline. So certainly that tends to keep us awake. The other aspect of things from perhaps a psychodynamic perspective is that there's an idea that if there's unfinished business, that perhaps our minds even at night can be churning on some of those things. And we also know that anxiety and depression are very closely related, and one of the first, even without being clinically depressed or having actually an anxiety disorder, just as human beings going through life, what we notice is that our sleep-wake cycle is disrupted when we're stressed. And so we start to experience perhaps early morning waking, difficulty falling off to sleep because we're ruminating over things. So there's a whole lot really going on there. In addition to the fact that anxiety makes us tired, So that's one of the major features of anxiety, is just an overwhelming fatigue. And so to cope with that during the day, of course, we have more coffee, and other things, and then that in fact contributes more to that state of heightened arousal.
I think we said last week that it's a difference between us as cognitive creatures who think, reason, plan, estimate, so that an animal like one of our cats has no anxiety response until there's actually a threat, like a dog
from you,
and then all of those chemicals kick in, whack. But we just have to think about something that we're worried, fearful about, and whack, they kick in. So those chemicals that would perhaps trigger us into fight or flight then start churning around, and they have that sort of effect. Really, a really helpful comment. Other comments from around the tables?
To me, it's I just lose patience real quickly. So I just don't need anything else to come on board. Thank you very much. Got enough already. So something else comes on, it's just like bang, and I'll be very quick with my responses, which aren't necessarily very friendly. That's what I talked about. We also talked about coping mechanisms on here as well, and interestingly, what you just said is what most of us actually got back to, doing something that delivers that order back into our lives. Some write lists, some would clean up, some like to cook, something that sort of brings order and sort of allows you to complete something almost, or almost achieve something. You can tick it off, and it sort of makes you feel better.
I think that many aspects of that would be a really healthy response, I think, to anxiety, because sometimes anxiety and other things can be perhaps a warning sign that actually a life is just getting out of control. And really, we humans are made for routine. And we're made for order, and we're made for, under God's hand, we're made for dominion over important parts of our lives. And so I think that's actually great, and that problem solving, writing lists. Some people get to the point with their anxiety that they actually are unable to make decisions at all, and so some people can write lists and lists of lists about the lists and never get anywhere. So as long as it's not in that sense, I think kind of trying to prioritise and order things, and then just move forward and make a move without having to be held back by anxiety is important.
I think we most probably mentioned when we live too fast, we've got too many things going, and the world is helping us get into that, and that causes stress and anxiety because you can't quite keep up. And someone said about when you see all the needs of people, am I doing enough to help everybody? And I get agitated over that sort of thing.
Yes, we live in a very expanded village now, don't we? And particularly for those of us who are engaged heavily in social media, the people with whom we're in contact cover a vast geographical and time distance, so there's never a switch off, I think many years ago there was a French theologian who wrote a book about the meaning of the city, and he was commenting on the fact that we're actually not structured creationally for the sorts of relationships that are now expected and demanded of us in this high technological society. Any other comments from the tape? Sorry, Sue, you were going to say something?
No, I was just thinking I was involved in counselling a young man who'd come as a refugee to Australia and was grappling with learning English as a second language as well as many other things, but he had quite a significant problem with tiredness and getting to his TAFE courses. But he was actually all through the night trying to keep in touch with his only family and friends who are in the refugee camp, a completely different time zone, whilst the only other family and friends he had been moved to other camps in the United States. And then, and children we do see are in fact on their phones often for hours and hours at night, trying to keep in touch with friends all over the world, and then trying to get to school and do their business during the day.
That's an example exacerbated by his circumstances, but we mentioned the name of Dr. Paul Wetham, one of our colleagues, and Paul's research has indicated that loneliness and isolation is one of the biggest issues that Australian society is facing. And then when we consider the age, the demographic, some years ago, someone told me who worked within the department, whatever it was called then, for planning and urban development, that at that stage, 25% of households in Australia were single occupancy. And that would increase to 50% within 20 years. That sense of isolation and loneliness, and then trying to find connectedness, is a really desperate thing that we're built for community, and that desperate loneliness. Any other comments before we go on?
One thing that I just thought was an interesting comment I heard from a psychologist who said that today's normal children they experience the same degree of psychological pathology, he called it, so stress, strain and mental illness, as psychiatric patients did 50 years ago.
Yeah, wow. There you go. One of the things that I think will have emerged in all of this is that worry and anxiety, if we put the spectrum a little bit further along, is a very common problem, and it's an issue which has become increasingly placing increasing demands on us in terms of a society. One of the things that also I think will have emerged is that primarily anxiety is a future-related thing. It's what will happen if, what will become of. So the prognostication, the looking towards the future, then buys into issues about control. Who controls that future? What control over that future do we have? Which then takes us to the level that really a lot of this stuff is about where your trust is placed. Who do you trust with not just your present but your future? And if all of that's in your hands, then how can you manage it all? So we'll pick up some of these things when we come back after the break. Well, welcome back after our break. During the time that we were having our break, a number of us spoke together, and someone in the basement here shared the fact that at times in the past, when they've been particularly anxious, they used to go into a very closed space, into the wardrobe in fact, and just sit quietly or lie down on the floor in there. And we had a bit of discussion about what might be happening in that space, and I guess the best guess is that at that stage that seemed to be a safe space to go to. Do you have any thoughts about that, Kirsty? Do you think, what happens when someone comes to retreat like that? Is it looking for a safe space, or is there something else going on, do you think?
Look, not commenting, I don't know who made the comment, so not commenting on that particular situation, but just generally there are some things to say. One is that we believe that none of our memories are actually ever really lost, that somewhere they're stored in our brains, and so that you might go through the day and suddenly perhaps smell fresh baked bread, and that might take you to a safe space because perhaps you had a grandfather you're very close to used to bake bread. So for someone, the idea of just being in the quietness and perhaps the dark and an enclosed space is actually something that would be really therapeutic for them, and perhaps that's attached to a memory that is stored back there somewhere, probably in the emotional part of the brain, but kind of manifests itself in that way. The other aspect of that, and again, I'm not talking about this situation in particular, but is that there is a tendency in anxiety, but if we move from that to talking about anxiety disorders, that the tendency is to want to withdraw and to want to avoid. And so that's really what perpetuates an anxiety disorder. We want to avoid the situation which gives us those feelings which we can't soothe ourselves in, and which we feel so powerless and so overwhelmed in. And that's quite normal, but it can become dysfunctional. So if you fear of flying, or you fear of public spaces, or fear of failing in public means that you can't actually get out of your house, your world gets very, very small as you try and withdraw from all those frightening experiences. And in fact, there is a type of anxiety where we fear the experience of fear itself. And so we fear all those bodily responses. And part of the treatment for actually coming out to that is, like Noel suggested earlier, coming into the light, letting go of the secrecy and the shame of that. And also, if something is safe, might not feel safe. So I'm not talking about jumping in front of a truck, but if something is safe, so public speaking, getting into that elevator, having that difficult conversation with a person, even for some people saying no for the first time in their lives to a friend or to requests, that's actually safe, but you might have avoided that your whole life. They call it touching the tiger. You know, imagine a tiger at the zoo who's behind the bars, it's safe, you can touch the tiger. The most therapeutic thing you can do is to actually break that cycle of avoidance and to take any opportunity you can just to be spontaneous and to touch the tiger, so to go out of your comfort zone.
Thank you for the comments, which have been very candid and helpful and open and honest, and that really is part of the role of community together. These issues that we're speaking about, as we said, thrive on silence, they thrive on secrecy. Loneliness exacerbates them. The best cure for or help that we can find in most of these situations is actually to be part of this sort of affirming community, this accepting community, which is of course what the Christian community was created to be and designed to be, but sadly has not always been. We've become very judgmental too with our own members as much as anyone else. I want us to come back to some of the comments that Kirsten was making earlier about the bodily responses, but ask that in the context of a couple of Bible passages. These are two very, 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 very well-known Bible passages on this theme. Matthew 6 verses 25 to 34, and then Philippians chapter 4 verses 4 to 7. So read them out loud, and then we'll come back and have some comments on them in a minute. Okay, let's just bring ourselves together again. I just want to make a couple of comments and then draw Kirsten in from a medical psychological point of view about some of this. The first thing to say is that often we read passages like that as a list of commands, do not be anxious, do not be anxious, do not worry. I've never counted them, but someone told me years ago that there's 365 do not worry, do not fear, do not be anxious type statements in the Bible. And if that is the case, that's a pretty good coincidence, isn't it?
Quite a long leap year though.
So, well, there's 365 and a quarter of them each year. But it's a pretty good indication, the repeated statements that come to us in the scriptures, that this issue is one that the human race is constantly troubled by. So I think the way to read these statements is not primarily as commands, as though do this or else, do not worry, but actually pastoral statements. Both Jesus in Matthew, and we read the second one from Philippians, which is the Apostle Paul, I think they recognise the damage that anxiety does to us in relationship to one another, to ourselves, in relationship to God. And so they're not saying it with a fist on the table as a command, but as a pastoral thing to say, why are you going to destroy yourself by worrying? This is not what you're made for. So to hear it pastorally, the second thing to say, which probably might not have come through the translation, is that every pronoun in those readings, the Matthew 6 one and the Philippians one, is plural. So we take that to us personally, don't you as one individual person worry, but in fact all of them are plural pronouns. The you there is a plural you all the way through. So he's saying to a whole community who are engaged with one another as a community not to be anxious and worried and fret. A, so that the whole community can be encouraged, but B, so that every member of the community can encourage one another. But with those readings in mind, I want to ask this question. Those people here in this room or those watching who've done some reading about anxiety and related issues would probably say, rightly, that the newest research, research over the last 20 odd years, has indicated that anxiety responses arise from a very deep and ancient part of our brain structure called the amygdala, and that structure, if I can paraphrase as a lay person, that structure is sort of the threat control centre of the brain, and as soon as it kicks in, it activates the fight, flee or freeze instincts even before our conscious mind kicks in. And so sometimes people who write and research in this space say that you go into lizard brain mode, that it sort of hijacks your higher cognitive function, and that therefore sometimes leads people to think, well, if that is the case, there's nothing I can do. Like if my brain is being hijacked by this response that's coming from a very deep centre, which is not conscious, not part of our thinking, then A, what can we do about it? And B, doesn't it sort of make Jesus and Paul a bit outdated? Like they didn't know about that, and their advice seems a bit twee in relationship to that, a little bit naff. Kirsten, what do you think? How do you make sense of it?
So I think that's, again, there's probably a couple of parts to that question. The idea when we hear it, that part of our brain, which is the perhaps we think of the automatic control centre. If we are crossing the road and suddenly a car veers towards us, we have a sudden rush of adrenaline and other hormones, and we don't think about our options. We are just out of the way. You might hear your pants on the way, but you've got out of the way. You've grabbed a baby if you've got a baby, and you're gone. So it's a really important structure that we have that structure, or two little structures called the amygdala, so they're in pairs, and that limbic system, because we need those for survival. So if a car came careering through the glass, we would all duck. Part of the problem with that, though, is that once that threat happens and we're out of the way, that response can go on for a little bit of time, and sometimes that response is not always the most helpful response. So, for example, if there's a fire, maybe not in here, but in a big crowded nightclub somewhere, suddenly people trample each other to get to the door, whereas if we had perhaps just said, okay, let's just be calm and think about this, we'll get down low to the ground, we'll exit one at a time, then the police wouldn't have to find all the bodies that are crushed at the door. So that degree of anxiety actually makes us less rational. It also makes us less creative, and we sort of feel a bit straitjacketed towards a response. Some people have a what seems to be a perpetually overactive amygdala and limbic system, and that's an example of that, or just a metaphor really, is if you imagine a leaf falling on the car and the car alarm goes off all the time. So that's kind of the reaction that some people have just to everyday circumstances. Someone bumps into them, or they walk around a corner and don't expect to see someone, and rather than just stepping back, they have a really heightened startle response. So there are degrees of how much that that sort of automatic anxiety impacts us. But we talked a little bit last week, I think, about post-traumatic stress disorder, and that can be some of those features. But generally, if we're chronically anxious, we do tend to have a much higher startle reflex. Our creativity tends to dwindle, and we tend to put 2 and 2 together and get 20. We make these connections which actually are probably not accurate, and that feeds our anxiety. So perhaps if a friend doesn't reply to an email that we've sent, suddenly we have a whole list of reasons, including I shouldn't have sent that email, I'm a bad person, they've misinterpreted it, that they're angry with me, they're rejecting me. In fact, your friend's just on holidays. So that's just sort of highlighting, I suppose, that the impact of some of those deep brain structures. But what we also have, what's given us a cortex which overlies those deep brain structures, and that's the thinking part of our brain, which actually we do have control over. And anxiety is certainly treatable. So just purely from a medical point of view, the anxiety disorders are treatable and generally have pretty good response to treatment. And then if you think about from, I guess, a Christian world view also, I think there's a number of things to think about. You asked about, is it unrealistic for Paul to say be anxious for nothing? So I've been thinking about that myself during the week. What does that mean? And did a little bit of background reading into the verse and some of the Greek text behind it. So the be anxious about, the Greek I think is merimnate, something along those lines. And that the sense of that word, it's written in the ongoing present tense. The mood is in the imperative and it's in the active voice. So it's about not just saying, here and there in life, or maybe many times during the day, don't you dare be anxious, but it's about that constant overwhelming anxiety where you're thinking about and you're meditating on what might go wrong and what could go wrong and how you're going to fix it and how are you to blame and how you're going to get out of that possible situation. that just wears you down, that is ongoing. It's not so much about, don't have worries here and there. If your child comes home at 4 in the morning and their curfew was 10 at night.
And they're only 5 years old.
And at 5 years old. Of course you're going to worry. And in fact, I did a little bit more looking up, and in Philippians 2, just before, Paul actually says that he's anxious. He's talking about his friend Epaphroditus, and he says, all the more eager to send him to you, that you might rejoice in seeing him again, and so that I may be less anxious. So it's obviously, he's not talking about don't have concerns about things. It's talking about that perpetual practice of anxiety, which I think is certainly treatable. Medically, I'll just read something quickly, which is really sort of from mainstream medicine. It says at every stage of life and mental health, every person has the means to resolve his or her own inner psychological life by themselves. What is the only thing they can rely on? His own mind. So that's the self-empowerment talk that we would hear, but actually it's just the idolatry of self. So we're saying that essentially almost we're split into two. We've got one who's the therapist who wants to shape ourselves into some sort of strong, powerful, successful idol. And we've got the other side of ourselves who wants to, who's kind of looking over and assessing and judging, yes, is that good? Whereas the Christian idea is completely different. And I was doing a bit of reading about Martin Luther, who says, actually our God is the only thing that we can expect, or from whom we can expect good things from, and who we take refuge in distress. So see to it that you let me alone be your God and never seek another. So whilst it may be that God's appointed for us as Christians to walk down the path of seeing counsellors and therapists and maybe medication amongst a whole broad range of other things, we actually look through those, we look to God and we thank Him for them. And we receive them from Him as His gifts, rather than seeing those things as an end in themselves. And I think that, in a sense, makes all things holy, because we're receiving them from God, our Father.
Yes, the question that we came to at the end of the session, before our coffee and break, was, in whom do you trust? And in the face of the issues that we're talking about, our own resources fall short very quickly. And so in the basement, where those resources run out, in the darkness, we're surprised to find that God's already there. And He's been there ever before we entered the basement. We don't want to enter that dark space because we're a little bit frightened what might happen. We haven't been down there for a while and it's full of rats, perhaps. But in fact, that is the space where God is. He's not in the space where it's all sweetness and light and we're in control. Part of the question, I think, that a lot of Christian people wrestle with in this issue and related ones is, well, what's the role then of medications or going to see a psychologist or others? And the answer would be it's in the same way that you don't have any trouble getting milk from someone who might not self-acknowledge as a Christian. It's actually still God's gift to you to have that milk on your table. So we give thanks for our daily bread, no matter who in the chain has provided it. God's given us that daily bread. Just coming back to the passages that we've looked at then, the one from Matthew chapter 6 and the one from Philippians chapter 4, I'd like you to go back to them now at your table and concentrate on the verbs. The verbs. For those of you who don't know what a verb is, it's a doing word, you know. Except the verb to be is a verb as well. So just concentrate on the verbs in those two passages and say, what are the verbs saying? What are they telling us? Okay, have a look at that at your table groups or at home. Does anyone have any comments about what they've noticed in the verbs, if anything? Yeah.
I
Go.
do. A contrast in verbs in Matthew, what's chapter? 6.
Matthew 6.
Not 23. The contrast in verbs that Jesus is giving or encouraging us to do and comparing that to the verbs that God is doing.
Yeah.
We are asked to look and consider and seek, but
Yeah.
God is clothing, providing, giving us our daily bread, so to speak.
Yeah. It's beautiful, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's a receptive thing. It's a receptive thing. It's beautiful. Yeah. Wonderful. Wonderful. Anyone else?
Just that seeking, and then it'll all be added.
So
Seek and first seek God and His righteousness, and all these other things will be added to you, is what He says.
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. It's something that He adds, He gives. Yeah. Other comments from anyone else?
I think in Philippians 4 was the opposite of worry is to let your requests be known, pray. So the way to not worry is to pray, and keep that particular verse.
Yeah. And it's actually a replacement
Of that.
So worry is, if you like, a negative form of prayer.
Right.
It's a constant rumination on stuff.
Yes.
And the counteraction to that is a positive pray.
Yes.
To positively pray, commend it to God.
Right.
Yep. Worry in that sense is a form of meditation.
Right.
Yeah. Very helpful. Anything else?
From my version, I have the Message version, and I was reading it, and it says, don't fret or worry. Instead of worrying, pray. Let petitions and praises shape your worries into prayers. Let God know your concerns.
Right.
Before you know it, a sense of God's wholeness, everything coming together for good, will come and settle you down. It's wonderful what happens when Christ displaces worry at the centre of your life.
Yes.
Just says it more personally to me.
Yes.
In a way that, yes, you've got worries, but turn it into prayer and give it to God.
Yes. Yes.
And
Yes.
He'll calm you down. Yeah.
Yes. Very helpful. Very, very helpful. One of the authors that we've come across, he
Max Lucado.
yes, he used a little acronym: calm, celebrate, ask, leave, in the sense of leave it there, and then meditate on the things that are good and right and holy, calm. And that's very helpful. Anything like that we can put into our brains to give us the direction we need. But the main emphasis, of course, is the one that you brought out so beautifully at the beginning. God's doing all the action here in terms of the giving, the providing, the feeding, the settling. It's His peace, not our peace that we create for ourselves. Our response is to consider, to look, to see. You might remember back in the Old Testament at the time when Moses was standing between the Red Sea on the one side and the Egyptian army on the other. God says to him, the best thing you can do, Moses, is stand still and see. That's the whole of the life that we have in Christ, is to stand still and see what He's doing. Yes, please. Yeah.
Just a comment that struck me is that we don't have a Bible verse that gives us peace. You know, it's so tempting to think if I can just remember, if I could just get somehow a hammer and hammer Philippians 4 into my head, you know, or put it on the mirror along with my 50 other Bible verses and just remember them, I'll be a better person and I'll have that peace. And we don't even have, you know, the Bible itself, it doesn't save us. Theology doesn't save us. We have the living person of the Lord Jesus Christ who saves us. And it's his peace. It's the peace of the man who knew peace when he was dying, carrying all of our sins, and not just carrying them, but undoing them all. So actually, I think that's the profound difference that Christianity has to any psychotherapy or medication, is that, you know, the best that the world can say is forgive yourself. You know, let's move on and think you've got a brighter future. But actually, what Christ says to us is that I undo your sins and I've undone them, you know, for the past, the present and the future. And so we do have beautiful Bible verses, but we have a living God who they come from.
Thanks, that's very helpful. You remember before the break, Kirsten quoted that Old Testament passage from Deuteronomy, which we might have found a bit puzzling, but she rightly said, you know, this is looking at the time when they would have been in exile, away from anything they knew as familiar. Everything was tossed up in the air. There was a sense of them being under judgment. Jesus is able to say all of those things because in him that exile's come to an end. In him we're all brought home. And so consider it, look at it and receive it, because this is a completed thing that I've done and am doing. We've come to the end for tonight. Thank you so much again for your participation. I'm going to leave you with one little verse from the book of Proverbs, which says this: anxiety in the heart of a man causes depression, but a good word makes him glad. Yes. So perhaps we can take that with us as we go. Anxiety causes depression, but a good word, which we've had tonight, makes us glad. So thank you, and for those of you who are brave enough to come back next week, we'll be talking about guilt and shame, particularly focusing on guilt, but guilt and shame closely related, of course, and I think in there we'll probably find a bit of anxiety and fear as well. But thank you very much, and I hope those who've been watching elsewhere have found this useful too. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.